I am Spencer, 32 years old. For 10 grueling, exhausting years, I poured my blood, sweat, and absolute soul into building my family's business from a struggling, dusty basement repair shop into a $50 million tech empire. And my reward for surrendering my 20s to this company? At my father's 60th birthday party, while I was forced to stand in the back like a hired servant, my own brother looked at me and said the words that still ring in my ears. He said, "You are worthless in today's business world. It is time you step aside." And the worst part was not his arrogance. The worst part was watching my father, the man I had spent my entire life trying to make proud, simply smile and nod in agreement. They humiliated me, stripped me of my dignity, and cast me out in front of hundreds of our most elite clients and investors. But there is one massive, fatal detail they did not know. The core software running that entire $50 million empire, the very asset they thought they were stealing from me to secure their luxurious country club lifestyle, belonged entirely to me. And right now, as we speak, they are facing absolute, devastating ruin, drowning in crippling debt, and desperately begging for the mercy they never showed me. Before I tell you exactly what happened and how I brought their house of cards crashing down, hit that like button if you truly believe in justice. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the night everything shattered. The clinking of crystal champagne glasses echoed through the grand ballroom of the absolute most expensive hotel in our city. The air smelled of roasted duck, expensive perfume, and old money. It was supposed to be a warm, intimate celebration for my father Richard's 60th birthday. But Nathaniel, my older brother, had hijacked the entire evening, turning it into a massive, extravagant networking event to feed his own massive ego. The room was absolutely packed with people in custom-tailored suits and thousands of dollars worth of designer dresses. I stood near the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. I was wearing a simple, off-the-rack dark suit that I had bought 3 years ago. I watched the spectacle unfold with a heavy feeling in my chest. Nathaniel stood at the center podium. The spotlight was shining down directly on his perfectly styled hair, reflecting off the obscenely expensive watch he had bought using company funds. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The dull roar of the ballroom fell dead silent. I honestly expected him to talk about our father. I expected him to share a touching childhood memory, maybe raise a toast to the man who had given us life. Instead, he gripped the edges of the podium, looked out at the sea of wealthy investors, and dropped a bomb that effectively ended our family. He cleared his throat and announced that the board of directors had recently convened and agreed that the company needed a unified, visionary leadership to move forward. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, before his eyes locked directly onto mine across the massive room. His gaze was entirely cold, stripped of any brotherly affection. He told the entire room that effective immediately, he would be taking over as the sole chief executive officer of our family enterprise. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel raised a hand to silence them. He said that some people were better suited to background, technical roles rather than high-stakes leadership. He stated that I had been adequate in maintaining our legacy systems in the past, but to compete in today's aggressive market, the company required excellence and pedigree. And frankly, he said, his voice dripping with absolute venom, I was just not cut out for this level of elite business. The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked directly at my father sitting at the VIP table. I desperately expected him to stand up, to grab the microphone, to stop this absolute madness and defend his younger son. Instead, Richard was nodding along. He had a proud, gleaming smile plastered across his aging face. My mother, Margaret, sat right next to him, elegantly dressed in a gown that cost more than my first car, just staring down at her porcelain plate, refusing to even look in my direction. Nathaniel raised his voice louder, ensuring every single VIP client, every banker, and every family friend heard his final verdict. He called me worthless. He declared that my old-fashioned, blue-collar ideas were a liability to the brand's future. Hundreds of eyes turned to me all at once. I could literally feel their pity burning into my skin. I could feel the harsh judgment. Everything I had built from the ground up, every single weekend I had sacrificed, every sleepless night I had endured over the last decade, was being violently stripped away from me in the most public way imaginable. The tension in the ballroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone expected a massive scene. They expected me to start screaming, to throw a glass, to demand my fair share of the massive wealth they were essentially stealing from my hands. Instead, I took a deep breath. I stood up completely straight. I walked slowly and deliberately across the ballroom floor. My shoes made no sound on the thick, luxurious carpet. I walked straight up to my father's table. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped package. I placed it gently down right in front of his plate. I looked him dead in the eye, ignoring Nathaniel entirely, and simply said, "Happy birthday, Dad." Then I turned my back on all of them. I walked straight out of the grand ballroom, out into the cool, crisp night air, leaving behind the frantic whispers and the stunned stares of the city's elite. I did not go to a bar to drink the pain away. I did not go back to my empty apartment to cry. I walked to my car, gripped the steering wheel, and drove straight to my office downtown. The neon city lights blurred past the windshield, but my mind had never been more crystal clear in my entire life. Nathaniel honestly thought he had won the grand prize. My parents truly believed they could just push me out the back door and keep the $50 million machine running on autopilot. They had forgotten one extremely crucial, legally binding detail. The next morning dawned bright, clear, and utterly unforgiving. I arrived at the massive corporate office building at 6 in the morning. The security guard was surprised to see me, but he buzzed me in. I walked into the executive suite, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and took my seat at the absolute head of the massive mahogany conference table. At precisely 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors to the suite swung open. Nathaniel strode in, looking like a man who had just conquered the world, with my father right beside him. They were laughing about something, wearing the smug, triumphant smiles of men who thought they held all the cards. Those arrogant smiles vanished the exact second they saw me sitting calmly at the head of the table, sipping my coffee. Nathaniel stopped completely dead in his tracks. His face flushed bright red. He demanded to know what I was doing sitting in his chair. He sneered, his lip curling in disgust, and said he thought I would have had the basic human dignity to stay home and pack my boxes after being publicly fired last night. I looked down at the expensive watch on my wrist. I smiled a very slow, very cold smile. I told him we needed to have a little chat about the actual future of this company. My father stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to look intimidating. He used his stern, authoritative dad voice and told me there was absolutely nothing left to discuss. He firmly stated that Nathaniel was entirely in charge now, the board had officially approved the transition, and I was trespassing on corporate property. I set my coffee mug down on the wood. The sharp sound echoed in the quiet room. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the table. I told them they seemed to have forgotten a few massive, world-ending details while they were busy planning expensive parties and giving glossy magazine interviews. I pointed to the leather chairs across from me and told them to take a seat, because I was about to show them exactly how dangerous a worthless man could truly be. But to understand how we reached this point of absolute destruction, how my own flesh and blood could betray me so callously without a second thought, you have to understand the toxic dynamic that infected my family. Let me tell you how this nightmare really started, 10 long years ago, in a dusty, windowless basement smelling of burnt copper, old pizza boxes, and desperate ambition. Growing up in our suburban neighborhood, I was always the invisible child. In my house, there was Nathaniel, the absolute golden child who could do no wrong, and then there was me, the spare part kept in the background just in case. The dynamic was established early and enforced brutally. Nathaniel was undeniably handsome, incredibly charismatic, and aggressively average at his actual academics. But my parents treated every B- he brought home on a report card like he had just won a Nobel Prize in physics. When it came time for college, they sat me down at the kitchen table. My mother held my hand, tears welling in her eyes, and explained that they had to make a sacrifice for the greater good of the family. They completely drained their life savings. They took out a massive second mortgage on our childhood home. They even completely depleted the modest college fund my grandparents had left for me, all to send Nathaniel to an elite, ridiculously expensive Ivy League business school on the East Coast. I, on the other hand, was quietly enrolled in the local community college down the street. I drove a beat-up sedan that stalled at red lights and worked night shifts stacking shelves at a local grocery store to pay for my own textbooks. But the truth is, I didn't mind the public school route. I actually loved it because it allowed me the flexibility to spend my afternoons in my father's computer repair shop. It was a dingy little storefront in a dying strip mall sandwiched between a laundromat and a vacant lot. The sign out front was missing 2 letters. It barely made enough profit to cover our basic minimum wage salaries and keep the electricity on. But to me, it was a sanctuary. While other kids were partying, I spent my hours dismantling ruined hard drives, learning the complex architecture of code, and figuring out exactly how intricate networks communicated. I saw pure, untapped potential in that basement where everyone else just saw a dead-end, blue-collar job. Nathaniel would come home for Thanksgiving dinners, wearing expensive cashmere sweaters paid for by our parents' credit cards. He would sit at the head of the table, cutting into the turkey, and openly mock me. He would tell me I was entirely wasting my life rotting in a basement while he was out rubbing shoulders with future Wall Street executives and politicians. My parents would just laugh at his jokes, telling me I shouldn't be so sensitive. During my final year of college, while managing the front desk of the repair shop, I noticed a very distinct, repetitive pattern. The small business owners bringing their infected computers to us, the local bakers, the mechanics, the hardware store managers, all struggled with the exact same massive problem: inventory management and point-of-sale tracking. The commercial software available on the market was either completely unaffordable for a mom-and-pop shop or so incredibly complicated that it required a master's degree to operate. So I made a decision. I spent my nights coding. I drank cheap, sugary energy drinks and worked at a folding card table until my eyes physically burned and my fingers cramped. I built a proprietary software program entirely from scratch. I designed it to be clean, incredibly user-friendly, and highly efficient. When I finally finished the beta version, I excitedly showed it to my father. He glanced at the screen, scoffed, and dismissed it entirely. He told me to stick to fixing broken motherboards and leave the serious business to people with Ivy League degrees like my brother. But I refused to let it go. I quietly installed a free trial version for a local hardware store owner we serviced regularly. A week later, that owner came back. He didn't just buy a full premium license, he wrote me a check on the spot. Then, he went to his local HOA meetings and the Chamber of Commerce, and he told all his friends. Suddenly, the phone in the dingy strip mall shop wouldn't stop ringing. We weren't just fixing cracked laptop screens anymore. We were selling licensed software. Real, tangible money started rolling into the business bank account. For the first time in my entire life, my father looked at me with something remotely resembling genuine pride. He patted my shoulder one busy afternoon, looked at the rising sales numbers on the monitor, and said, "Maybe you actually have a brain in that head of yours, Spencer." It was just a tiny, fleeting crumb of affection, but to a young man utterly starved for his father's love and validation, it tasted like an absolute feast. I leaned into the business with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. I worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week. I skipped every holiday, every family gathering, every chance at a normal social life. I sacrificed the entire decade of my 20s. I personally handled every single angry client call, wrote every single line of code for the complex software updates, and meticulously managed the financial books to keep us out of debt. Slowly, agonizingly, our little repair shop evolved into a full-scale, highly respected tech solutions provider. Within 5 years, we moved out of the strip mall. We hit a massive financial milestone that I never in my wildest dreams thought was possible. $1 million in pure annual revenue. I remember sitting alone in the office late one night, looking at the glowing bank statement on my monitor, my hands literally shaking. I had done it. I had built something real, something undeniable. I deeply believed that this would finally be the moment I earned my permanent, respected place at the family table. I thought my parents would finally see me as an equal to Nathaniel. I was so incredibly, tragically wrong. The scent of real money is a very powerful, dangerous thing. It drifts across state lines and violently wakes up people who haven't bothered to speak to you in years. When the company officially hit $10 million in revenue and started making local headlines, Nathaniel suddenly lost his deep passion for his incredibly mediocre mid-level management job in New York. He showed up completely unannounced at our house for Sunday dinner. He walked through the door wearing a custom-tailored suit, flashing a heavy designer watch that he absolutely could not afford on his current salary. Over roast beef and mashed potatoes, he casually took a sip of wine and announced that he was moving back home. He looked right past me, focused entirely on our father, and said he felt it was finally time he took his rightful, destined place in the family business. He started throwing around massive, empty corporate buzzwords: synergy, scalable infrastructure, venture capital integration, paradigm shifts. He looked at me, gave a condescending little smirk, and said my little mom-and-pop operation was cute, but it desperately needed a real, educated business mind to reach the next corporate level. I almost choked on my drink. I put my fork down and looked at my father, fully expecting him to laugh Nathaniel right out of the dining room. I expected him to defend the blood and sweat I had poured into the company. Instead, Richard's face lit up like a child on Christmas morning. He slammed his hand on the table and told Nathaniel it was a fantastic, brilliant idea. He actually said the company desperately needed a professional, high-class touch to attract real investors. I immediately tried to protest. My voice shook with anger. I pointed out that Nathaniel didn't know the absolute first thing about software development, coding infrastructure, or our deeply loyal client base. But before I could finish my sentence, my mother, Margaret, immediately deployed her absolute favorite, most destructive weapon: maternal guilt. She slammed her napkin down and started crying, not just tearing up, full theatrical sobbing. She looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes and asked why I was being so incredibly selfish and greedy. She said I should be thrilled, absolutely honored, to share the heavy burden of leadership with my own flesh and blood. She launched into a massive guilt trip about family unity, about how a family that works together stays together, and how I was breaking her heart by being so jealous of my brother's education. Before the apple pie dessert was even served on the table, I had been completely demoted in my own creation. My father officially appointed Nathaniel as co-CEO. I was forcefully instructed to hand over exactly half the control of my company to a man whose greatest life accomplishment was successfully spending our parents' retirement fund on fraternity dues and expensive dinners. That Sunday dinner was the beginning of the end. The storm was brewing right on the horizon, and I was standing directly in its destructive path, completely unarmed. The next 3 years were a psychological and emotional living nightmare. With Nathaniel acting as the shiny, public face of the company, the entire corporate culture shifted drastically and violently. I remained trapped in the background, managing the actual grueling day-to-day operations, writing the complicated software updates that kept us afloat, and desperately trying to keep our massive corporate clients happy when they complained about Nathaniel's lack of technical knowledge. Nathaniel, meanwhile, spent his days playing golf at the exclusive country club, attending 3-hour expensive luncheons, and casually signing off on ridiculous, absolutely unnecessary corporate expenses. He convinced my father that to attract top-tier Silicon Valley investors, we needed to physically look the part. He signed a massive, overpriced lease for a huge, glass-walled office space in the most expensive downtown district. He bought imported Italian leather chairs for the lobby. And then came the absolute final, unforgivable insult. He used company funds to purchase a brand new, customized Porsche. When I saw the dealership invoice crossing my desk, I felt physically sick. I marched straight into his overly decorated, massive corner office. I slammed the invoice down on his glass desk. I demanded to know why the company was buying him a luxury sports car when we needed that capital for server upgrades. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just laughed, picked up the shiny Porsche keys, tossed them in the air, and told me to relax my blood pressure. He called the Porsche a vital promotional vehicle. He said I entirely lacked corporate vision, that I still thought like a small-town mechanic instead of a tech mogul. I bypassed him and went straight to my father. I laid out the financial reports, clearly showing the massive financial drain Nathaniel was causing. I showed him how close we were to missing payroll because of the country club dues and the car payments. Richard just sighed heavily and waved me away like an annoying fly. He sternly told me I was just being petty and jealous of my brother's natural charisma. My mother called me later that night, crying again, telling me I needed to stop causing drama about money and support my family's new elevated status. They were violently bleeding the company I built from scratch just to fund Nathaniel's massive ego. He started giving solo interviews to major tech magazines, posing for arrogant photos in front of the downtown building with his Porsche, and boldly taking absolute sole credit for the complex software architecture that I had personally designed while he was out drinking. But the vanity, the arrogance, the stolen credit, I could swallow that. The betrayal that came next, however, was something else entirely. It was a knife straight to the heart. I had a young director of sales named Lucas. I hired Lucas when he was fresh out of college, entirely broke, and struggling to pay rent. I trained him personally. I mentored him. When his wife had medical issues, I secretly authorized a massive salary advance and fought the board to get him an unprecedented commission increase. I trusted him with our most highly sensitive, lucrative VIP client accounts. I treated him like a younger brother. One evening, working late as usual while the rest of the executive floor was completely empty, I was running a routine security audit on our internal servers. I noticed some highly unusual, massive data transfers originating from the sales department. Someone was actively downloading our highly confidential proprietary client retention reports, our pricing algorithms, and our future expansion blueprints. They were forwarding all of it to an external, heavily encrypted email address. It took me 3 solid hours of relentless digging through the back-end code to bypass the encryption and trace the IP address. The downloads were coming from Lucas's terminal, and the encrypted destination email address belonged directly to Nathaniel. Nathaniel was secretly, methodically gathering the company's most vital data to completely bypass my authority and eventually push me out of the operations side entirely. And Lucas, the kid I had practically saved from bankruptcy, was helping him. I later found a drafted contract in the server cache. Nathaniel was formally offering Lucas a massive vice president title, a corner office, and a significant equity bump in exchange for spying on my department and handing over my client list. Lucas sold my loyalty and my friendship out for a fancy title and a slightly bigger paycheck. Sitting alone in that dark, cold office, watching the damning data logs scroll across my glowing monitor, something fundamental inside my soul broke into a million pieces. The desperate, pathetic kid who just wanted his father's approval and his brother's respect died right there in that desk chair. In his place, a very cold, incredibly calculating, and entirely ruthless man woke up. I finally realized the horrific truth. My family did not see me as a son, and they certainly did not see me as a brother. They saw me as a massive, tireless workhorse. And the exact moment I stopped pulling their heavy cart of luxury, the exact moment I demanded basic respect, they would send me straight to the slaughterhouse without a second thought. I didn't yell. I didn't confront Lucas or Nathaniel. I completely stopped arguing about the budgets. I stopped complaining to my parents about the Porsche. I played the role of the quiet, slightly defeated, obedient technical guy. But behind the scenes, in the absolute dead of night, I began digging a massive, inescapable trench around my life's work. I remembered a very specific, incredibly fortunate incident from exactly 3 years prior. We had desperately needed a rapid, massive injection of capital to secure server space for a huge national client. The bank had required heavy personal guarantees. Nathaniel was far too busy vacationing in a luxury villa in Europe with his high-maintenance fiancée, Valerie, to be bothered with bank paperwork. My father was incredibly stressed, overwhelmed, and complaining about his blood pressure. I had calmly offered to put up my own personal life savings and entirely leverage my private real estate investments to independently secure the massive loan. In exchange, I drafted a completely legal, ironclad contract purchasing an additional 26% of the company's founding shares. When I placed the thick stack of legal paperwork on my father's desk, he was in a massive rush, frantically trying to leave the office to attend Nathaniel's lavish engagement party across town. Richard was annoyed that I was bothering him with tedious administrative details. He didn't read a single paragraph. He didn't look at the percentage numbers. He just grabbed a pen, signed the bottom line of every page, and rushed out the door. That one hasty signature legally gave me 51% of the entire company. A quiet, unassailable, absolute majority holding. But I didn't stop there. I knew Nathaniel would eventually try to steal the actual technology. The core software, the massive engine that generated exactly 80% of our total corporate revenue, was due for a massive structural update. Instead of developing this new, vital version under the family company's legal umbrella, I quietly used my own money to establish a completely independent, privately held entity, Innovate Solutions LLC. I secretly hired a ruthless private legal team. I poured hundreds of hours into the development on my own private servers. Then, wearing my hat as the co-CEO of the family business, I drafted a licensing agreement between my new private LLC and our family company. The agreement legally allowed them to lease and use the software for a strict, fixed term. And I made absolutely sure the expiration date of that term was very, very specific. I didn't breathe a word of this to a single soul. Not my parents. Not Nathaniel. Not Lucas. Not even my closest, most loyal team members. I just kept my head down, forcing a smile through the agonizing Thanksgiving dinners, listening quietly while Nathaniel bragged loudly about his genius business strategies and his Porsche. I sat there, eating my turkey, knowing with absolute, terrifying certainty that he was standing squarely on a trapdoor with a noose around his neck, and my hand was resting quietly on the lever. By the time the family company officially hit $50 million in annual revenue, the atmosphere in the executive office was completely suffocating. Nathaniel practically walked around the building like an absolute king, demanding coffee from interns and barking orders at senior developers who knew 10 times more than he ever would. Valerie, his fiancée, practically treated the corporate headquarters like her personal shopping mall, strutting in with designer bags and demanding the accounting department reimburse her for client entertainment lunches that were actually just spa days with her friends. My father's 60th birthday was rapidly approaching. Margaret, driven by her absolute obsession with high society status, decided it needed to be the social event of the entire decade. They completely ignored the company's tightening cash flow and spared absolutely no expense. They rented the grand ballroom of the city's most elite hotel, hired a world-renowned Michelin-starred catering team, commissioned a massive ice sculpture, and sent out thick, embossed gold invitations to every major political and corporate player in the state. The budget they drafted was astronomically reckless, but Nathaniel loudly insisted it was an essential networking investment. Exactly a week before the massive party, my mother called my personal cell phone. She didn't ask how my day was going. She didn't ask if I was exhausted from working the weekend. She used her cold, authoritative tone to explicitly dictate my role for the evening. She told me, in no uncertain terms, that I was to manage the coat check room and handle the guest list clipboard at the front entrance. I was stunned into silence. I asked her to repeat herself. She sighed, sounding incredibly annoyed by my presence. She said that Nathaniel needed to be completely free to mingle with the VIPs and potential investors. She literally said that my awkward, technical demeanor and my lack of high fashion suits would just get in the way of the high-level corporate conversations. My own mother, the woman who raised me, assigned me the humiliating role of a glorified doorman at my own father's birthday party, all to ensure her golden child shined brighter. I gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. A wave of pure, white-hot anger washed over me, but I forced my voice to remain perfectly, chillingly level. I simply told her I completely understood and hung up the phone. 2 days before the massive event, I received a secure, encrypted text message from Victor, our longtime family corporate lawyer. Victor was a tough, old-school guy, a man who had known my father for over 40 years and had watched me grow up in that repair shop. He asked me to meet him immediately at a rundown diner on the far edge of town, miles away from the corporate downtown offices. When I slid into the sticky vinyl booth across from him, Victor looked incredibly exhausted and deeply conflicted. He ordered a black coffee, waited for the waitress to leave, and then slid a thick, unmarked manila folder across the table. I opened it. Inside were heavily redacted, deeply confidential drafted contracts for a massive corporate buyout. Nathaniel wasn't just planning to push me to the side. He was in active, secret negotiations with Gavin, the aggressive CEO of our absolute biggest rival tech firm. Nathaniel was actively planning to sell the entire family business, cash out his massive assumed share of the profits, and leave me entirely out of the negotiations, effectively stealing my life's work to fund his retirement at 35. But the buyout contract had one massive stipulation. Gavin required a legally unified leadership structure before signing, meaning I had to be officially, legally removed from the board entirely before the sale could go through. That was the real reason behind the birthday party ambush. Victor looked at me, stirring his coffee slowly. He told me that ethically, he couldn't legally advise me against his primary clients, my father and brother. But he said his conscience simply wouldn't let him sit by and watch a good man get slaughtered by his own blood. He tapped the folder with his finger. He reminded me of the private software licensing agreement I had filed through my separate LLC years ago, the one I had securely stored in his firm's vault. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Spencer, you need to check the exact expiration time on your intellectual property lease." I looked back at him, feeling a cold smile form on my face. I didn't need to check the paperwork. I knew exactly, down to the minute, when it expired. I had designed it that way. The legal right for my family's company to use the software that generated 80% of their revenue expired at exactly midnight, the exact night of my father's 60th birthday party. I thanked Victor, paid for his coffee, and drove back to the towering glass office building. The air inside the car felt heavy, charged with electricity, exactly like the atmosphere right before a massive, destructive thunderstorm breaks. I walked through the sleek glass corridors of my company, looking at the brilliant developers, the hardworking sales team, the massive empire I had built with my bare hands from a damp basement. I knew that by tomorrow morning, this entire building would be a war zone. The night of the grand party arrived. Just as my mother ordered, I stood out in the chilly lobby, checking heavy wool coats for men in $10,000 tuxedos. Through the massive double doors, I watched Nathaniel holding court. He was drinking wildly expensive scotch, laughing loudly, acting like the undisputed master of the universe. He had absolutely no idea the ground beneath him was crumbling. At exactly 11:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the lease expired, I quietly slipped away from the coat check and stepped into a dark, quiet side office. I opened my secure laptop. The screen glowed in the dark. I had pre-drafted a series of devastating emails. The first email was addressed to our top 50 VIP corporate clients. I invoked the specific key man clause explicitly written into their contracts, officially informing them that I was no longer associated with the leadership of the company, and therefore, they were legally permitted to terminate their massive service agreements immediately without penalty. The second email went to my core development team, the brilliant, loyal coders led by Sylvia, the woman who had helped me build the actual infrastructure. I offered every single one of them immediate, secure positions at my private company, Innovate Solutions LLC, complete with a 20% salary increase and full corporate benefits. I set the automated server timer. I scheduled the devastating emails to send to hundreds of inboxes at exactly 3 a.m. Then, I calmly closed the laptop. I smoothed the lapels of my cheap suit. I walked back into the blinding lights of the grand ballroom, arriving just in time to hear Nathaniel tap his crystal glass and ask the wealthy crowd for their undivided attention. I watched him take the microphone, his chest puffed out in arrogance. I watched my parents gaze up at him with sheer, unfiltered adoration. And I stood there, completely unfazed, listening as he publicly called me worthless and demanded I step aside. I thought the worst was over. I thought the betrayal couldn't possibly cut any deeper than that public execution by my own family. I was so incredibly wrong. The real war, the absolute destruction of their lives, was about to begin in the morning. The executive suite at the very top of our downtown high-rise was designed to intimidate people. It had sprawling, floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the entire city skyline, custom-imported Italian leather chairs, and a massive mahogany conference table that felt as heavy and immovable as a bank vault. I sat at the absolute head of that table. My black coffee had gone completely cold in the ceramic mug an hour ago, but I did not care. I was not there to drink coffee. I was there to execute a corporate and familial demolition. I kept my eyes completely locked on the heavy double glass doors. The digital clock mounted on the far wall silently flipped its bold red numbers. It was exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Right on cue, as if scripted in a terrible reality television show, the heavy glass doors swung open. The noise of their arrival was loud, intentional, and aggressively arrogant. Nathaniel walked into the room first. He was wearing a brand-new, custom-tailored navy blue suit that I knew for a fact cost more than the average entry-level developer's entire monthly salary. He had a smug, completely untouchable, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He was holding a cup of ridiculously expensive artisan coffee in one hand and swinging his sleek, monogrammed leather briefcase in the other. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had just successfully stolen the world. My father, Richard, walked into the room right behind him. He looked incredibly proud, standing taller than he had in several years. He was wearing his favorite, incredibly expensive cashmere golf sweater, projecting the flawless image of a wise, wealthy elder statesman who had finally passed the corporate torch to his incredibly worthy, highly educated heir. They were laughing loudly about something, completely lost in their own inflated sense of victory. They did not notice me sitting in the shadows at the head of the table right away. Nathaniel walked straight toward the massive windows, looking out over the sprawling city real estate like a conquering king surveying his newly acquired kingdom. He took a long, arrogant sip of his coffee and told my father that the absolute first order of business on Monday morning was to completely renovate this entire executive floor. He loudly declared that he wanted an open-concept, Silicon Valley-style layout, something incredibly modern to impress Gavin and the new venture capital investors during the upcoming buyout negotiations. He even joked about knocking down the walls to build a private executive gym, using the company's emergency operational funds to do it. Cleared my throat. The sound was quiet, steady, and deliberate, but in that massive, echoing room, it hit the silence like a gunshot. Nathaniel spun around so fast he nearly spilled his artisan coffee all over his expensive silk tie. The arrogant, untouchable smile vanished from his face in a fraction of a second, completely replaced by a look of profound annoyance and utter, unfiltered disgust. He stared at me sitting completely still in the massive leather chair at the head of the table. His face immediately flushed with hot, angry color. He took 2 aggressive steps forward and loudly demanded to know what the hell I was doing sitting in his chair. He sneered, violently curling his upper lip, and asked if my blue-collar brain was simply too stupid to understand the very clear, very public termination that had occurred at the birthday party last night. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the door and told me I was illegally trespassing on private corporate property. He explicitly threatened to call the building security guards, the local police, and his personal lawyer to have me forcibly dragged out of the building in handcuffs if I did not leave the premises in exactly 10 seconds. I did not move a single muscle. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I looked right through him, feeling an overwhelming, incredibly powerful sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. I looked at the man who shared my blood and told him he should probably take a seat, because we needed to have a very serious discussion about the legal transition of corporate power and the reality of his future. My father stepped forward, stepping firmly in front of Nathaniel like a shield. He puffed out his chest, employing his deep, authoritative dad voice, the exact same condescending tone he used to scold me when I was a helpless 10-year-old child. He sternly told me that there was absolutely nothing left in the world to discuss. He firmly stated that Nathaniel was entirely, legally in charge of the company now. He said the board of directors had officially, unanimously approved the transition of leadership late last night after my so-called embarrassing exit from the party, and my technical services were no longer required or desired. He told me to go down to the basement, pack my cheap personal belongings into a cardboard box, and leave the premises quietly to avoid any further humiliation or a potential lawsuit for corporate disruption. He even casually mentioned that taking this graceful exit was the only way I would ever see a single dime of my future inheritance. I looked directly at my father. I really, truly looked deep into his eyes. I desperately searched his face for any microscopic trace of regret, any tiny sliver of paternal love, any hesitation about throwing his youngest, hardest-working son out onto the cold street to secure Nathaniel's promotion. There was absolutely nothing. He was completely, tragically hollowed out by his blind, unwavering worship of his golden child. He viewed me as nothing more than a broken piece of machinery that needed to be discarded. I placed both of my hands perfectly flat on the cool mahogany wood of the table. I told them they seemed to have forgotten a few massive, world-ending details while they were incredibly busy planning extravagant $100,000 parties and giving glossy, arrogant magazine interviews. I pointed directly to the leather chairs across the table from me and told them to sit down immediately before the financial ground completely fell out from under their feet. Just then, before either of them could utter another insult, the conference room doors opened again. Lucas, my former trusted protege, the director of sales, and the man who had ruthlessly stabbed me in the back to secure his own promotion, walked into the room. He was carrying a massive, thick stack of printed financial reports and our highly confidential client retention algorithms. He stopped completely dead in his tracks when he saw me sitting at the head of the table. He looked instantly terrified, his eyes darting frantically back and forth between Nathaniel's angry face and my completely calm demeanor. He started stammering, sweating visibly, and asked if he was interrupting a private family matter, nervously clutching the stolen data to his chest. Nathaniel waved him into the room dismissively. He aggressively told Lucas to come inside, lock the door, and witness this entire interaction. Nathaniel loudly announced to the room that this was the absolute perfect training opportunity for the brand new vice president of sales to see exactly how a real corporate leader properly handles a disgruntled, terminated, utterly worthless former employee. A second later, Valerie, Nathaniel's incredibly high-maintenance fiancée, strutted into the room right behind Lucas. She was carrying a massive, limited-edition designer handbag and wearing oversized, expensive sunglasses indoors like she was an A-list celebrity avoiding the paparazzi. She looked at me like I was a piece of rotting garbage that the night janitor had accidentally forgotten to sweep up. She let out a massive, dramatic sigh, checking her diamond watch, and immediately started complaining to Nathaniel. She whined that they were going to be late for their exclusive celebration brunch at the country club. She loudly complained that the energy in this room was completely toxic, that she needed to go to her spa appointment, and she demanded that I be thrown out immediately so they could discuss buying a massive piece of luxury real estate with their upcoming buyout bonus. I sat there in total silence. I let them talk. I let them dig their graves so incredibly, astronomically deep that they would never, ever see the sunlight again. I watched Nathaniel puff up his chest for his captive audience, feeding off Valerie's entitlement and Lucas's cowardly obedience. He leaned entirely over the massive table, getting his face uncomfortably close to mine. He launched into a vicious, deeply personal monologue. He told me that I was a bitter, jealous, utterly pathetic little man who could never handle the harsh reality of high-level corporate business. He aggressively gloated about the upcoming buyout. He didn't say Gavin's name directly, but he loudly bragged that he had single-handedly secured a massive, life-changing acquisition deal that would make our family incredibly wealthy and secure their legacy forever. He said my blue-collar, small-minded mentality was holding the entire $50 million company back, and by surgically cutting me out of the picture, he had finally unlocked our true financial potential. He practically spat the words directly at my face, aggressively declaring that he was the absolute visionary. He was the true leader, and I was just a disposable, highly replaceable mechanic who had completely outlived his usefulness. He finished his vicious little speech, crossed his arms tightly across his chest, leaned back, and waited for me to break down. He waited for the tears to start falling. He waited for the desperate, pathetic begging. He waited for me to ask for my job back or beg for a meager severance salary. Instead of crying, I simply reached down into my battered, 10-year-old leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. I pulled out a massive, incredibly thick, heavy manila folder. I lifted it up and dropped it squarely in the absolute center of the mahogany table. The heavy, solid thud of the paper hitting the wood echoed loudly and violently in the suddenly silent room. I looked directly into my brother's eyes, my face a completely blank, expressionless mask of cold stone. I told him that he talked entirely too much for a man who legally owned absolutely nothing in this world. I looked over at Valerie and told her the extravagant celebration brunch was officially permanently canceled. I always thought the absolute worst part of my life was the devastating humiliation of the previous night at that birthday party. I was completely, wonderfully wrong. The absolute best part of my entire life was about to begin right now. Nathaniel stared down at the thick manila folder sitting in the exact center of the polished table like it was a live, ticking explosive device. He let out a harsh, incredibly condescending laugh that bounced off the glass walls. He asked me what kind of pathetic, legally desperate stunt I was trying to pull on my way out the door. He loudly declared that he did not have the time or the patience for my childish, blue-collar games, and he reached his hand out to aggressively sweep the folder off the table and into the trash can. I spoke up, my voice cutting cleanly through the tense air like a freshly sharpened razor blade. I strongly advised him to open the folder, sit down, and carefully read the very first page of the legal documents before he made the absolute biggest, most financially devastating mistake of his incredibly miserable life. My father, growing highly impatient and visibly angry at my defiance, stepped forward. He aggressively snatched the heavy folder off the table, muttering under his breath about how I was always causing unnecessary drama and ruining family events. He violently flipped open the heavy cardboard cover, put on his expensive, gold-rimmed reading glasses, and began reading the bold legal print on the top document. I sat back and watched his face. I watched the exact, precise microscopic moment his entire fabricated reality shattered into a million irreparable pieces. It took exactly 10 seconds. The healthy, vibrant, confident color completely drained away from Richard's aging face, leaving him looking as pale as a ghost. His hands, gripping the thick legal paper, began to shake violently, making the paper rattle loudly in the quiet room. He dropped his expensive reading glasses directly onto the mahogany table with a sharp clatter. He looked slowly up at me, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated, paralyzing terror. He opened his mouth to speak, to yell, to ask a question, but absolutely no words came out of his throat. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life burn to the ground. Nathaniel loudly rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by our father's dramatic reaction. He aggressively grabbed the stack of paperwork right out of Richard's trembling hands. He looked down at the document. He read the bold, capitalized legal header from the state registry. He read the exact, legally binding ownership percentages. It was the official, notarized corporate shareholder registry. It clearly, undeniably, and legally outlined the exact ownership structure of the $50 million tech empire. I leaned back comfortably in my heavy leather chair. I steepled my fingers together and spoke very slowly, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum, devastating impact. I reminded my father of a very busy, highly stressful Tuesday afternoon exactly 3 years ago. I reminded him of a massive server expansion project that required immediate, heavy capital to avoid bankruptcy. I reminded him that he was in a desperate, frantic rush to leave the corporate office to attend Nathaniel and Valerie's lavish, incredibly expensive engagement party. I told them that while my father was exclusively worried about picking out the right designer tuxedo and drinking champagne, I had drafted a completely legal, ironclad contract to actively purchase an additional 26% of his founding shares. I reminded him that I assumed the massive financial risk, using my own personal life savings and putting up my own private real estate as collateral so the company would not fail. I pointed directly at the heavy black ink of the signature line at the bottom of the page. I reminded Richard, in front of everyone, that he had blindly signed those documents without reading a single word because he could not be bothered to care about the details. Nathaniel's face turned a violent, terrifying shade of deep purple. The veins in his neck actively bulged against his expensive silk collar. He slammed both of his fists down on the mahogany table with incredible force, rattling the coffee cups and making Valerie jump backward. He screamed at the top of his lungs that it was absolutely impossible. He violently yelled that it was massive corporate fraud, that it was an illegal, deceitful trick, and he threatened to hire an entire army of the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the state to drag me through the mud. He explicitly threatened me with a massive, life-destroying lawsuit, screaming that he would take every single penny I owned, sue me for emotional distress, and make sure I ended up living on the streets. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I let him scream until his throat was completely raw and his breath was heavy. When he finally stopped to take a frantic breath, I smiled. It was not a warm, brotherly smile. It was the terrifying, cold smile of an apex predator watching its prey step directly into a steel trap. I looked at him and calmly told him that filing a massive lawsuit would actually be a phenomenal idea, assuming the family company was actually worth a single penny. I reached directly into the thick folder and pulled out the second heavy stack of legal documents. I pushed them across the highly polished wood directly toward his shaking hands. I told him to look at the second page and read the expiration clause. Nathaniel snatched the paper. His eyes darted frantically across the complex legal jargon, his breathing becoming shallow and panicked. I clearly explained the devastating situation to the entire room in a perfectly calm, conversational tone. I explained that exactly 3 years ago, when Lucas started secretly stealing my data, I fully realized that my own family viewed me as a completely disposable asset. So, I took massive, legally binding precautions to permanently protect my life's incredible work. I explained that the core proprietary software, the massively complex algorithm that actively ran the entire business, the exact flawless product that generated exactly 80% of our massive revenue and secured every single one of our VIP clients, was not and never had been legally owned by our family company. I explicitly explained that I had personally funded, coded, and developed the entire updated software architecture completely off the corporate clock, using my own private servers in my own home. I had legally patented the entire technology under a completely separate, privately held entity named Innovate Solutions LLC, where I was the sole owner. Our family company merely held a temporary, highly restricted licensing agreement to legally use the software to service their clients. I slowly lifted my arm and looked directly at the face of my watch. I looked back at Nathaniel, whose face had now gone completely pale, entirely drained of his arrogant blood. I coldly informed him that the temporary licensing agreement had officially, legally expired exactly 9 hours and 15 minutes ago, right at the stroke of midnight. I told them that as of this exact, precise second, their highly valued $50 million company was absolutely nothing more than an empty, hollow, worthless shell. They owned absolute zero intellectual property. They had absolutely no product to sell. They had absolutely nothing to leverage. They had absolutely nothing to sell to Gavin or any other tech rival in their secret buyout deal. My father collapsed heavily and completely into one of the leather chairs. He aggressively clutched his chest, breathing in short, heavy gasps. He looked at me, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whisper, and accused me of violently destroying the family legacy. He asked how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood, completely ignoring what he had done to me the night before. Before I could even answer his hypocritical question, the heavy oak doors opened once more. Sylvia, my brilliant, fiercely loyal lead developer, and the woman who had stood by my side through every grueling, sleepless night shift, walked confidently into the room. She completely ignored Nathaniel, Valerie, and Richard. She walked straight up to my side of the table and handed me a massive, thick stack of sealed white envelopes. She looked directly at me, gave a firm, respectful nod, and loudly announced to the room that the entire technical development team, all 45 senior engineers, system architects, and core coders, had officially immediately resigned from the family company. She stated, with a hint of a smile, that they had all enthusiastically accepted their new, highly compensated positions at Innovate Solutions LLC, effective immediately. She turned perfectly on her heel and walked out of the room without looking back. Lucas, the trader who was still standing completely frozen in the corner of the room, suddenly realized with absolute horror that he had bet his entire career on the wrong horse. He dropped his stolen financial reports all over the floor. He started violently stammering, desperately trying to apologize, frantically trying to claim that Nathaniel had viciously manipulated him into stealing the data. He literally begged me to let him keep his salary, his job, and his newly promised promotion. I completely and utterly ignored him. He was entirely irrelevant to me now. He was a ghost. Then, the absolute final nail in the coffin was hammered home. The massive, high-tech speakerphone sitting in the absolute center of the conference table buzzed incredibly loudly. The flashing red light indicated an incoming, high-priority VIP call from our absolutely biggest corporate account. I reached out and firmly pressed the speaker button. The booming, aggressive voice of Marcus, the ruthless CEO of an international logistics firm that single-handedly accounted for exactly 30% of our annual revenue, filled the entire room. Marcus did not offer a polite morning greeting. He simply stated that he had received my early morning, legally binding email. He announced, in a completely cold, ruthless, businesslike tone, that his elite legal team was formally invoking the strict key man termination clause buried in their massive contract. Because I was no longer actively overseeing the project, they were pulling their massive account immediately and moving all their business directly to my new LLC. He loudly wished me incredible luck in my new venture, stated he looked forward to our new contract, and hung up the phone. The sharp, dead dial tone echoed endlessly in the silent room. I looked directly at Nathaniel. The smug, completely untouchable golden child was physically shaking so hard his teeth were practically chattering. His expensive, custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting Halloween costume. Valerie was staring at him in absolute, unadulterated horror, slowly realizing that her endless supply of designer bags, luxury real estate dreams, and unlimited expense accounts had just violently evaporated into thin air. I leaned entirely forward, placing my elbows on the table. I looked directly into my brother's terrified eyes. I told Nathaniel that his fake corporate empire was officially, completely dead, and I was the one holding the shovel to bury it. The absolute silence in the massive executive suite was completely suffocating. It was the incredibly heavy, soul-crushing silence of total, absolute, unconditional defeat. My father sat violently slumped over in the expensive leather chair, staring completely blankly at the highly polished wood table as if he had just witnessed a ghost. Nathaniel was completely, entirely frozen in place, his eyes darting frantically and wildly around the corners of the room, desperately searching his brain for a legal loophole, a magic trick, a hidden clause, any possible microscopic way out of the massive, inescapable grave he had so arrogantly dug for himself. I stood up slowly from my chair. I carefully buttoned my cheap, off-the-rack suit jacket. I looked down from my position of absolute power at the two men who had mercilessly tormented me, consistently belittled my intelligence, and actively tried to permanently strip away my dignity in front of hundreds of people just 12 hours prior. I laid out their immediate future and their limited options clearly, concisely, and coldly. I told them they had exactly two paths forward from this exact minute. I outlined option number 1. I gather my briefcases, I immediately walk out those heavy glass doors, and I never, ever look back. I legally take my 51% absolute majority shares. I take my entirely patented, deeply essential software. I take my entire highly skilled engineering team. And I take every single loyal, high-paying VIP client on the roster. The family company immediately, inevitably declares total, catastrophic Chapter 11 bankruptcy before the end of the week. The massive, astronomically expensive corporate lease on this ridiculous, unnecessary downtown building immediately defaults. Nathaniel, as the acting co-CEO who aggressively signed the paperwork, becomes entirely personally liable for the staggering, massive corporate debts he had so recklessly accumulated over the last 3 years, specifically including the absurd, fraudulent business loan he used to buy his promotional Porsche. They face absolute, devastating financial ruin, the complete loss of their personal real estate, the destruction of their retirement funds, and a massive barrage of incredibly nasty, incredibly expensive lawsuits from angry, unpaid vendors. Then, I outlined option number 2. They completely, unconditionally surrender right now. My father and Nathaniel immediately sign entirely unconditional, irrevocable letters of resignation, permanently stepping down from any and all leadership roles and completely relinquishing their powerful seats on the board of directors. I immediately take absolute, total, unquestioned operational control of the entire company. I legally merge the remaining assets of the family business directly into my private LLC. They physically retain their minority shares but are legally, permanently classified as silent, non-voting partners. They receive a very modest, strictly fixed monthly dividend that will barely cover their basic living expenses, but they permanently lose all access to the massive corporate bank accounts, the unlimited luxury expense cards, and they are permanently banned from ever stepping foot inside the building itself. They are entirely banished from the empire forever. Nathaniel's face physically twisted into an incredibly ugly, monstrous mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. He violently lunged forward, slamming both of his hands onto the mahogany table, violently screaming that I was an absolute monster. He aggressively yelled that I had maliciously planned this entire destruction all along, that I was a deceitful, evil snake patiently waiting in the tall grass to steal his rightful inheritance and ruin his life. I stared him down, my eyes completely cold, completely empty of any brotherly affection. I raised my voice just enough to cut through his hysterical screaming. I told him that I spent 10 agonizing, back-breaking years trying to be a good, loving son and an incredibly loyal brother. I built this massive, multi-million-dollar company with my own bare, blistered hands while he was out drinking expensive scotch and playing golf at the country club. I pointed my finger directly at his chest and told him I only planned this brutal execution exactly 12 hours ago, right after he stood on a brightly lit stage, looked me dead in the eye, and publicly, maliciously called me worthless in front of the entire city. I aggressively tapped the glass face of my watch. I told them they had exactly 5 literal minutes to make their final decision before I grabbed my briefcase and permanently chose option number 1 for them. They broke. They completely, utterly, and entirely broke under the massive pressure. My father, with hot tears streaming rapidly down his deeply aged, wrinkled face, slowly picked up the expensive silver pen with violently trembling fingers and signed his own unconditional resignation on the dotted line. Nathaniel fiercely fought it, violently arguing with the air, desperately looking to Lucas and Valerie for support that wasn't there. But eventually, fully realizing that he had absolutely zero legal leverage, zero product to sell, and faced incredibly crushing, life-ending personal debt and potential jail time for embezzlement, he violently, aggressively scribbled his signature on the legal paperwork, tearing the paper in the process. I immediately picked up the desk phone and called the front security desk. I coldly instructed the heavily armed guards to immediately come up to the executive suite, physically escort Nathaniel and Richard from the premises, and explicitly ordered them to permanently deactivate their corporate keycards. Later that exact same afternoon, the massive emotional fallout finally arrived at my doorstep. My mother, Margaret, aggressively burst through the heavy doors of my new office. Her expensive makeup was completely smeared across her face, and she was crying hysterically, making a massive scene. She desperately tried to immediately deploy her usual, highly toxic tactics of emotional manipulation. She rushed frantically toward me, desperately trying to wrap her arms around me in a fake hug, sobbing loudly about the sacred nature of family unity, and screaming about how I was violently tearing her fragile heart into a million pieces. She literally fell to her knees and begged me to forgive Nathaniel. She claimed he was just incredibly stressed about the upcoming wedding, heavily claiming he didn't mean any of those horrible, nasty things he said at the birthday party. She explicitly told me I needed to step back, apologize to my brother, and let Nathaniel run the company to preserve the peace and avoid a massive family funeral of relationships. I stood up firmly from behind my massive desk and held up my hand like a brick wall, stopping her completely dead in her tracks. I looked down directly at the woman who had coldly assigned me to work the coat check at my own father's birthday party. I told her the emotional manipulation and the intense guilt trips completely stopped today. I told her that she had aggressively enabled Nathaniel's toxic, narcissistic abuse for my entire life, constantly demanding that I severely sacrifice my own happiness, my own salary, and my own dignity just to feed his massive, fragile ego. I established a permanent, incredibly firm, completely unbreakable boundary right then and there. I told her I loved her deeply because she was my mother, but I would never, ever, under any circumstances, allow her or anyone else in this deeply toxic family to treat me like a second-class citizen or a disposable servant ever again. I pointed firmly to the open door and told her to leave my office immediately before I had security remove her as well. The real-world consequences for Nathaniel were incredibly swift and absolutely, brutally devastating. Without the massive, inflated corporate salary and the highly illegal, unlimited corporate expense account to fund his fake lifestyle, his entire world completely collapsed in a matter of weeks. The massive banks aggressively called in his incredibly high-interest personal loans. The luxury dealership legally repossessed the highly customized, expensive Porsche right out of his suburban driveway in the middle of the night. He completely defaulted on the massive mortgage for his luxury downtown condo, losing the incredibly valuable real estate entirely to the bank. And Valerie? The exact second the designer bags completely stopped flowing, the expensive dinners ended, and the black credit card started bouncing at the mall, she completely packed her incredibly expensive, imported luggage and left him. She abruptly canceled the massive, highly publicized wedding, keeping the incredibly massive diamond engagement ring to pawn, completely and utterly abandoning him to wallow alone in his absolute financial ruin. Nathaniel was left with absolutely nothing. A completely hollow, empty man entirely destroyed by his own massive arrogance and greed. A full, incredibly busy year passed since that fateful, explosive morning in the downtown conference room. The massive, choking dust from the corporate explosion finally settled to the ground, revealing a completely transformed, incredibly healthy landscape. Under my absolute, unquestioned sole leadership, Innovate Solutions LLC, which had fully legally absorbed the completely hollow, empty shell of the old family company, did not just barely survive. It absolutely thrived far beyond my wildest, most ambitious expectations. Without Nathaniel's ridiculous, incredibly wasteful spending on country clubs and sports cars, and without my father's deeply outdated, fearful, micromanaging leadership style holding us back, we were incredibly agile and aggressive. We rapidly expanded our proprietary software directly into massive international markets. Our total annual revenue completely tripled, hitting numbers my father had never even dreamed of. My core team, the brilliant, incredibly loyal people who had stood firmly by my side when the corporate fire was burning at its absolute hottest, were deeply, financially rewarded for their incredible loyalty. Sylvia was officially, publicly promoted to Chief Technology Officer with a massive corner office. I legally structured an incredibly generous, highly lucrative profit-sharing plan and a massive 401k matching program for all my senior developers and sales staff. I ensured that they were aggressively building their own generational wealth alongside mine, completely securing their families' financial futures, paying off their mortgages, and fully funding their children's expensive college funds. I completely built a brand new corporate culture entirely based on actual merit, incredibly hard work, and mutual respect, completely and utterly erasing the toxic, destructive nepotism of the dark past. As for my biological family, the dynamic was permanently, forever altered. The mandatory Thanksgiving dinner that year was an absolute masterclass in incredibly awkward, deeply painful tension. I attended the dinner mostly out of a lingering, fading sense of familial duty, but the old, toxic power structure was completely, entirely dead and buried. Nathaniel sat silently at the far end of the long dining table, looking incredibly haggard, deeply exhausted, and entirely defeated by life. I had heard through the grapevine that he was currently working a miserable, incredibly stressful mid-level sales job at a terrible, failing logistics company, barely scraping by paycheck to paycheck just to slowly pay off his massive, lingering personal debts and aggressive legal fees from his various defaulted contracts. He didn't say a single word to me the entire agonizing evening. He couldn't even look me in the eye. My father looked at least 10 years older. The incredibly arrogant, untouchable spark in his eyes was completely, permanently extinguished. After the dry turkey was served and eaten in complete silence, he slowly pulled me aside into the dark hallway. He looked directly down at his shoes, his voice barely above a raspy whisper, and offered an incredibly clumsy, deeply broken verbal apology. He told me he was incredibly, deeply sorry for taking my massive contributions for granted all those years. He admitted, his voice cracking, that he had been completely, utterly blinded by his own foolish, superficial expectations for Nathaniel and his obsession with high society status. I stood there and quietly listened to his broken words. I formally accepted his apology, primarily because carrying the incredibly heavy, toxic burden of deep anger is physically and mentally exhausting, but I maintained a very clear, very cold, incredibly firm emotional distance. I looked at him and told him I forgave him for the past, but the absolute, unconditional trust was permanently, irreparably broken and shattered. I told him we could remain polite, we could casually share a tense holiday meal once a year, but we would never, ever be close again. The basic, fundamental respect was finally there, forced by my success, but the deep, unconditional family warmth was a permanent casualty of the vicious war they had eagerly started. It was the absolute final funeral of our old, toxic family dynamic, and I was completely, deeply at peace with it. The absolute ultimate validation of my entire journey came exactly 18 months later. I received a formal, incredibly heavy, embossed envelope in the mail. It was an official, highly prestigious invitation from the dean of the exact same elite, incredibly expensive Ivy League business school that Nathaniel had attended, the exact same elite school my parents had completely drained my modest college fund to pay for. They desperately wanted me, the community college graduate, to be the premier keynote speaker at their massive annual entrepreneurship summit. The specific topic they formally requested I speak about: hidden strengths, the incredible power of underestimated leaders. I proudly accepted the invitation. Standing on that massive, brightly lit stage, looking out at a sea of thousands of highly ambitious, wealthy students and elite professors, I didn't speak a single word about petty revenge. I didn't aggressively gloat about financially crushing my enemies or destroying my brother's life. I spoke passionately about absolute, unbreakable resilience. I spoke about the immense, quiet, undeniable power of putting your head down, doing the grueling, unglamorous work, and knowing your own absolute, undeniable worth, especially when the people closest to you aggressively tell you that you are entirely worthless. Sometimes, late at night, when the massive, sprawling corporate office is completely empty and perfectly quiet, I sit back in my heavy leather chair and look out the massive glass windows over the glittering, endless city skyline. I slowly open the bottom, locked drawer of my heavy mahogany desk. Inside, still perfectly, immaculately wrapped in its original silver paper and tied with a bow, is the small, heavy birthday gift I quietly placed in front of my father on that terrible, life-changing night. It is a thick, custom leather-bound photo album. It meticulously documents the entire grueling, incredible 10-year journey of the company, starting with a grainy, faded photo of me and my father sweeping the dirty floors in that dusty, windowless basement repair shop, all the way to the grand, highly publicized opening of the massive downtown corporate office. Maybe someday, many, many years from now, when the deep, agonizing emotional wounds have finally, fully turned into faded, painless scars, I will finally hand it to him. But for now, it firmly stays securely locked in the drawer. It serves as my quiet, daily, incredibly powerful reminder that our absolute greatest, most defining strengths almost always forge themselves in the intense fires of the very things others brutally and foolishly underestimate about us. I learned the absolute hardest, most painful lesson a man can ever learn in this life. You cannot ever force people to properly value you, not even your own flesh and blood. But you absolutely, undeniably have the power to stop handing them massive discounts on your life. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own toxic family? Have you ever had to draw a massive, hard line in the sand and physically walk away from the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally to protect your own sanity? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to absolutely smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next incredible journey.